Hello, and in today's video we're going to have a look at the making of original Dungeons & Dragons 1970 to 1977. Now when I filmed this I was just going to give you an overview, but I've decided to turn it into a bit more of a review because I have subsequently read the contents of this book and I've got some opinions, and as you can see here, just quickly showing you the back of the book, but we'll come back to this with a closer look. So this should give you a little bit of a sense of scale. We'll have another look at this in a short while. But yeah, the making of original D&D 1970 to 1977 is a 50th anniversary book. It's a lush, very heavy, very chunky hardback book. And on the back here it talks about this being the definitive look at how Dungeons & Dragons was made. And I think that's a little bit of marketing hype. So we get a nice preview of what's inside. So it talks about the first draft, so 1973, and obviously some background info, some letters between David and Gary, and the first printing of Zero Edition. So that's the version that talks about halflings being hobbits, which they had to correct to halflings because obviously hobbits was a term that Tolkien claimed for themselves, and so much more apparently. And I think it's sort of a bit of a mixed bag. It's if you're someone who wasn't around 50 years ago and you've never seen anything to do with original D&D, you're going to be really pleased with this. So here you go. As you can see, it's as wide or wider than a novel is high. Anyway, I've got the shrink wrap off, and this little marketing blurb on the back actually is also a character sheet. So that's a nice little touch that it's nice to see. Yeah, I'm not sure how useful this is, but a nice little touch. So as you can see, if you slip off this rather lovely dust cover, underneath you've got a really nice high quality hardback with an embossed cover and lovely gold lettering. So this is a really good quality book with nice quality pages, nice quality hardback binding, and little bookmark ribbons. So there's a lot to like here. It also does include a lot of the original documentation, which again is a great selling point. So this, this is definitely a product that sort of justifies its rather high price. However, for me, there are some disappointments, partly because not a lot of what's in here is actually new. So we start off here with a table of contents. So we've got a foreword, a preface, the precursors, what sort of led to D&D, 1973, which is sort of the first draft, which then very quickly became the original version that we got hold of, and then obviously extra bits that came out to support the game, and then of course an afterword where they basically say, and what was next was first edition AD&D, which of course caused a really big bun fight between Dave and Gary because TSR tried to basically deny Dave his royalty checks, I guess. So yeah, the foreword and the preface, there's some good stuff in here. However, there's also some commentary about how the past is a difficult time and how it was very much a white middle class male domain, and that's caused some people on the internet to get quite triggered and upset, talking about how they feel they've been attacked, and I can sort of see where they're coming from, but equally it's sort of a throwaway paragraph, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But it's sort of your standard corporate disclaimer that, hey, we're giving you documentation as it was in the 70s, and yeah, there were some really bad attitudes back then. So again, you may choose to get offended by that or just ignore it. So for me, it starts off quite well, like this Great Worms documentation. I've not seen this before. So this is before D&D was even really a thing. However, Gary was getting into sort of fantasy battles. So he wrote in to a sort of a Lord of the Rings play-by-mail thing. And as you can see, they present you the original documentation, including some difficult to read handwriting. And this is both a pro and a con. It's great that they're showing you the original unedited, unredacted document. Although I say unredacted, some addresses have been blanked out. But the problem is, it would also be nice if they sort of retyped it so you can actually read the damn thing, because some of these documents are easier than others. This one's not too bad. So it talks about black dragons, green dragons and white dragons, for example. And it's interesting to see how even back in the sort of early 70s, a lot of what would become a D&D staple was already in place. So, by the time you get to 1974, these dragons have been hanging around for a good 4 years or more. Equally, we've got a map here of the Great Kingdom, which obviously would become part of Greyhawk, but because of the collaboration between Dave and Gary, there's also some sort of Blackmoor in here, so the Egg of Coot, for example. So already we're getting a bit of cross-contamination between two separate individuals with two separate campaigns, and you can see how I think Gary got really excited with the potential of what Dave was doing with Blackmoor, and he decided to create something, and he was trying to get Gideon Games to produce D&D that he saw as a supplement really, or a new evolution of chainmail. So we then get some other documents which I'm not sure how desperately applicable they are to D&D. So we've got some nice artwork for medieval stuff, including a load of weaponry. I mean, the main thing for me that struck me when I looked at this page was, yeah, Gary was obsessed with pole arms, wasn't he? And that's something that you'd see in first edition. And for a lot of us gamers, how relevant is all this stuff? Now, this document could really do have been retyped, because it's nice to see it, but it's really hard to read. It's tiny, tiny little text. And so this is, again, part of the pros and cons. So, yeah, some nice artwork. Do we really care about pole arms beyond it's a pole arm? Well, Gary did, that's for sure. But also it's got some info about different types of maces, and again, I think it's important, it is interesting, but yeah, is it that important? Now, this is something that is important. So chainmail and the fantasy supplement. Now, when I first saw this, I was like, oh, they've reproduced the whole of chainmail. That's fantastic. I've got the original PDF, so it's not a problem, but sadly, it's not really the whole of chainmail. It's mostly just the fantasy supplement and a few tables. So if you actually want to play a game of chainmail, you are probably still going to need to pick up the PDF. And they've used the second edition version because that's apparently the earliest version they can get hold of easily. The first edition is pretty tricksy. And of course, this was actually published by Gideon Games, and this could cause problems because I believe Dave published Don't Give Up the Ship with Gideon Games and never really got the royalties, and also, you know, they were starting to have struggles and eventually would fold, and so D&D was meant to be published by Gideon Games, but that never happened and would eventually lead to Gary setting up TSR. So yeah, chainmail, really important to some people in regard to OD&D, but I'm not sure how important chainmail actually is. I know Gary made a big deal about how you must have chainmail, and chainmail led to D&D. I think that's open to debate, but it's a very good set of medieval miniature battle rules, so you know, you probably want to pick up the PDF. Might be a bit tricky to you if you're a 5th edition role player who's never played wargaming, and there's a decent amount of text on the left here, but again, I could have done with a little bit more detail. So again, before D&D came out, we've got a little article by Gary on armour, and as you can see, it's a little bit harder to read this. It's sort of bluey purple text, and it sort of talks about, you know, what is splint mail, what is ring mail. We then get a little battle report of a war game, so the Battle of Brown Hill. So this is where fantasy is starting to creep into historical wargaming, much to the upset of some of the old grognards. In some ways, things never change, by the way. But what's much more interesting to me is this, the mention of Braunstein. Now, if you've seen the Blackmoor documentary, you'll realise how important Braunstein was to Dave creating the medieval Braunstein, which then creates Blackmoor, which then creates D&D. And there's not really enough information here, I think, about that. You know, for a definitive making of D&D, I think they could have put more effort into the making of bit and a bit less of an here's the original document. So that's sort of a slight disappointment. But, you know, they do have a good stab of it. They do have vague dates, which is something that's very interesting because, of course, you know, we're talking stuff 50 years ago. A lot of people are dead. They maybe didn't actually officially date it, and you're going by, you know, memory rather than fact. So some of the dates are a little bit wishy-washy. So it's good that they sort of thought, well, it's probably circa this time. And they do talk a bit about that. But this is where Dave created something that would inspire Gary. And so the book does talk about how without Dave, you don't get D&D, but without Gary, you don't get D&D either. So we then get one of the first character sheets. So this is an artifact of, I believe, the Blackmoor game. And this is something that would be what would become D&D. So we've got these weapon skills, we've got discussions of, you know, what sort of class they are. But interestingly, class also sort of refer to their level, but they also talk about level. So this is where things were in a bit of state of flux. And I believe it's all 2d6 based. So you've got lots of weapon skills here showing you the wargame inspiration, including some black powder weapons, interestingly enough. And on the other side of the sheet, we're going to have some personality or attributes, as we'd probably call them these days, or stats, and some skills. So the front cover is all the stuff you need for fighting, which is what was really important to sort of the more wargamey aspect of the game. But on the back is the more role-play stuff, the sort of characteristics and the skills. And this is a fascinating document that I think could have done with a bit more attention in the book. I mean, there's a decent chunk of text on the left there, but it could be more. So here you go. Here's the stats. So brains, looks, credibility, etc. And then on the right, horsemanship and cunning, which I believe does appear in the 1973 draft of original D&D. So this stuff is really fascinating to me. So, what was the game they were playing? And I was hoping to have more of that in here. Now, it might be that's been bagsied by the Blackmore gang for their History of Blackmore book. So, yeah, it's very interesting to see this compared to what we end up with in 1973 and subsequently 1974. And this really, really is the thing that fascinates me the most and fails to deliver. So this is where I think the definitive look doesn't quite work for me. So again, it's great to see this, but where's the commentary on it? I mean, it is there, but I guess I wanted more, particularly for what is quite an expensive book. But, there you go. So could we sort of create a game just off this artifact? Maybe we could, but there's going to be a lot of assumption, a lot of logical jumps. Now, it's possible. I'm not sure if Mr. Gaylord is still alive. I forget just now. But if he was, let's hope someone's interviewed him and extracted as much as possible from his memory banks. As I say, I got a feeling this might appear in the Blackmore documentary. So although it's probably new to a lot of D&D players, it's not necessarily new to people who are really aware of, the history of D&D. So that's where I have, I guess, a problem with this book. That a lot of this stuff is interesting, but it's not necessarily revelationary, and it's not discussed. But anyway, cunning. Bear that in mind if you get this book and look at the 1973 draft. So as you can see, teeny block of text there. Needs to be more. Outdoor survival, that also gets a nod, and they do need to include it. Is something that was listed as essential to D&D. I'm not sure. I mean, the main reason you needed it is for this map, which was often used as a generic template for travelling across land from point to point, and unfortunately a lot of the interesting stuff that links to this map is not included in the book. I guess maybe because it sort of links to Judges Guild, and therefore TSR, Wizards of the Coast, they don't have the rights to it, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, it's nice to see the map here, and it's great for those of you who've not seen it before. There is a version of this available online as well. But anyway, all of that eventually leads to this, where I believe Gary has played a game with Dave, and he's very excited, and he wants to get a draft of D&D, go in to publish it. And you get a feeling that Gary's sort of harassing Dave a bit. Now, as I said earlier, Dave's maybe a bit reluctant due to his beef with Gideon Games, but obviously that would ease a bit once Gideon Games are out the picture and TSR has been founded, and D&D then gets published, and Dave's fairly happy until Gary sort of does the dirty on him. But anyway, good luck reading this. It's scribbled text again. I find it interesting that they provide us with this. So this is allegedly 1972. So this is showing you that things are moving, and we end up in 1973 with a draft of D&D. Now, this document might appear in some court case files. I haven't cross-checked what's in the court case versus this. But again, this is going to be quite exciting for people who are only vaguely aware of D&D, showing you what D&D could have been. I don't really show you much of this document, I'm afraid, in this video. But this is something I want to really have another deep read of, just to see what we could have ended up with, because I created Grey March based on sort of some rumours about what this document was. So that would be interesting to see. So this is really interesting. This is D&D in its raw form, and based on ideas that Dave passed to Gary, and Gary then sort of typed up and then sent back to Dave to correct. So as you can see here, we've got our types of adventurers. Now, interestingly here, I believe levels is called classes, which is very confusing. So, a first level fighter is, I'm not sure if it's first class veteran, yeah, so you can see what would become D&D is already in place pretty early on here in 1973, but there are differences. The stats in particular seem to be a difference, and there's also a bit in here about becoming harder to hit, which is something that got cut in the original D&D that we actually got. So initially it came out as a brown box. You'll notice the logo for TSR is GK, and this is in many ways one of the best versions of D&D. Everything you need to play was in here, and it was a very pure, if sometimes wonkily laid out and produced document. Now, you can buy these as PDFs, and you're not going to get exactly the version presented here because they're giving us the first printing. So as you can see, if you've ever wondered what does TSR stand for, well, it's Tactical Studies Rules, and they would end up doing stuff with Games Workshop over here in the UK, and this could be a really good look for those of you who've never even seen original D&D. But for us old veterans, this is in some ways a little bit less exciting. As we've got these as PDFs or scans, or actually got the original boxes. But the key bit here is this is a first printing, so I believe hobbits get mentioned rather than halflings, for example. And I think it's nice that this is a physical printout of the book, but I've made my own copies, so less exciting. Anyway, I skip past that, but let's have a quick look at the contents before I talk about articles and editions. So there you go. That was in the 1973 draft. It then got reproduced in 0 edition, and it may even have got slightly adapted to then be in subsequent versions like BX and first edition. Anyway, articles and editions is the bit that I thought would be interesting to me, because a lot of these articles I haven't seen. For example, this is a lovely map, I believe, of Castle Gygax. So we've then got a load of really interesting articles that Gary wrote, and you can see Gary was really prolific. We then sort of drop into Greyhawk, which was the first supplement for original D&D. Now this turns original D&D into basically first edition D&D. So when Gary wrote first edition, he basically took original D&D, his Greyhawk supplement, and created a new game, although how new it is very debatable. So this here, again, I believe is a first printing of the Greyhawk supplement. It's interesting it was the first, because obviously it was Gary's work, but this maybe is because he was having trouble with Dave, and I think even by 1974, Dave and Gary's relationship was not the best. I wouldn't say they were enemies, but it was tense, and Gary was having trouble maybe getting stuff out of Dave, and it leads you to this interesting thing where Gary very much puts himself forward as the driver of D&D, which in some ways he was, but without Dave we wouldn't have it. Little interesting quirk here, this picture always fascinated me. This is allegedly of a bugbear, this is a ghoul, and then we've got like a snake and a kobold. Very RuneQuest-y if you think about it. Yeah, this bugbear, very, very reminiscent of the cover of a RuneQuest adventure. Anyway, we then get to some bits that are slightly new to me. I didn't buy the strategic review back in the day. And then, of course, we get the next supplement, Blackmore. Now, Blackmore has, I believe, been available as a free PDF for a while. I believe Dave had the rights to it, so made it available before he died. And I think Dave really got a bit of the short end of the stick with this supplement. I think it does talk about it in the text discussing this, but Dave was having trouble giving Gary the information in the way he wanted it, so they just threw this together. And I think this document has got quite a lot of pencil sketching on it, which is probably Gary or TSR preparing for the court case against Dave, basically going through the document saying, oh, this has nothing to do with Dave actually, this was created by Gary or some other guy. So yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, the Blackmore supplement, I think wasn't as good as Greyhawk. It did include some extra classes. It did also include some good stuff, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I think it didn't paint Dave in a great light, which helped with Gary's sort of I'm amazing, Dave had barely anything to do with D&D narrative that he developed later. But what is interesting is we get the Temple of the Frog, which I believe is one of the first published sort of adventures for the game, really. How usable it would be for you as a game master, well, you might have trouble. But, it is the first apparently published adventure by TSR, and it's sort of buried in Supplement 2. And of course, it's very much part of Blackmoor rather than Greyhawk, which is interesting because both Blackmoor and Greyhawk don't really tell you much about Greyhawk or Blackmoor. So it's very hard to actually run a game in that setting when there's hardly any setting information. But obviously there's a bit about it in this here. And as you can see, a graph paper, a sort of hand-drawn map. So we're very much at the start of, publishing role-playing games. So it's very much amateur, sort of homemade feel. Anyway, the success of D&D led to eventually become the white box. Now, I believe the white box is where they stripped out things like hobbits and replaced them with halflings, just to avoid Tolkien giving them a hard slap. And this version of the box was sitting on a shelf for yonks at my game store, and I never picked it up, and I've been kicking myself ever since, because back in the 70s and even in the 80s, it was $10 or basically £10 here in the UK. And that doesn't seem much by modern standards, but you've got to bear in mind that it was probably more like £50 to £60 back in the day. But yeah, I could have picked up a copy of this for £10, which, be worth several hundred today. And also I'd have a proper copy of original D&D. Instead I've got my homemade printouts. But there you go. It is what it is. And this would then end up being rebranded as the Collector's Edition when I believe first edition came out, and of course that's why I didn't buy it, because why would I buy this old rubbish version of the game? First edition's much better. St. Gary has told me so. But yeah, that was a mistake. But yeah, what can we do? You can't change the past, sadly. But yeah, that's that. Anyway, we now get into some extra bits, and interesting little diagram here of a gentleman which looks very much like he's from Mr. Barker's Tecumseh setting, Empire of the Petal Throne. Yeah, great setting. Unfortunately, it's a bit problematic due to Mr. Barker's political viewpoints. So it's interesting they've included it here. I must admit, I didn't read too much the blurb for this, but what is interesting, we do get an early version of the alignment system. And it also shows you how pretty early on D&D had started to inspire other games. So, Empire of the Petal Throne is basically D&D with percentile dice. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's the simplest way to explain it. And of course, we then got things like Tunnels and Trolls and RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu and all those other good games, and Traveller. And that's where things started to diverge from the template set out here in the early 70s to mid and late 70s. So yeah, this is an interesting little artifact, and again this has shown you how maybe things are evolving away towards what would become Holmes Basic, which would then become AD&D. So Supplement 3, I think Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons probably got pretty upset with this. A scantily clad lady being sacrificed to demons as part of Eldritch wizardry. Ooh, you're teaching our kids demonology. This supplement, I think, is not quite as good as the earlier ones. It does have some good bits in, but a lot of it is just spells and artifacts which are less interesting to me. It's nice to have it here, including some lovely pictures which we'll have a look at. But yeah, I think to me, Supplement 1 was really good. Supplement 2, yeah, it was okay. Supplement 3, yeah, some bits, but not that great. And Supplement 4, pretty dire, to be honest. Anyway, Supplement 3 got some nice bits in. I think it's got some extra classes and spells and items, but the main bit for this is the demons. So we actually get some diagrams which would get refined and become better in the monster manual that would come out in 1977, the first of the first edition AD&D booklets, rather interestingly. And what's particularly interesting about these pictures of diagrams is, look at this fella here. Doesn't he rather look like a changer of ways of Sanich? You've got to bear in mind, Games Workshop sort of started off as a D&D distributor, and they basically borrowed ideas from D&D. You also notice here we've got the Hand of Vecna, so a lot of the things that we now associate with D&D, they were already in place before 1980, in fact possibly sort of by 77. And yeah, Hand of Vecna, I mean, I'm sure that's going to ring bells with people, for example, Stranger Things, for example. So yeah, a lot of D&D hasn't really changed since original D&D. So yeah, I always find that fascinating, that, you know, how in some ways they just got it right in 74. Now obviously there were some rough edges that they've polished over the years, but yeah, to me, pretty much all you need was here in these original supplements. And as I say, supplement 3 is really the last supplement I think you need. Supplement 4 is pretty rubbish, although rather irritatingly it's not actually included in this book, as you will see very shortly. And yeah, we're pretty much coming to the end of the book now, and I can sort of see why they've done that, but it is a bit annoying when this is the definitive version of D&D. So anyway, some more bits and pieces here. We then get a little discussion of Dragon, which, when you consider the date here, you know, nice colour copy, pretty good production quality, and definitely as we move into the 70s and the 80s, the production quality started to increase. Now this picture is burnt into my mind, so this apparently appeared in Dragon first. I believe it was in the Monster Manual or Player's Handbook, I can't quite, Dungeon Master's Guide. But there you go. Yeah, the final supplement, they slag it off a bit here, and in some ways I don't blame them. I was pretty disappointed with it. And we just get the cover of it, the actual contents aren't here, and what they're moaning about is statting up the gods, which I do agree with. I think that was ridiculous, because, you know, this book should have been an amazing thing about creating gods and how that changes your clerics. But there you go, and so that's all they wrote. So nice back cover. Hopefully you've enjoyed that quick flick through the content. So it's very much a mixed bag for me, this product. It's great that they've reproduced all the original stuff. It's going to be really good for people who've only ever been exposed to 5th edition D&D. For us old grumbly grognards who actually own the originals, you know, the amount of information here could be more, and I'm really hoping the Blackmore guys do a slightly better job at talking about Blackmore, because without Blackmore there is no D&D, but equally without Gary there is no D&D. Let's just bear that in mind. So there is some good information in here, but, you know, what do we want? Do we want more of the information and less of the original material? I like the fact they've given us both, but I mean, how big would this book be if we'd had a really nice long article and also the original pages, and the original pages retyped so they're a bit more legible? So yeah, it's very much a mixed bag. I'm not sure it's definitive, but it's pretty good. Before we finish, let's just show you there the ribbons. As you can see, lots of ribbons, so top quality product, lots to like about it, but it's not quite what I was hoping for, but I don't regret buying it. So I do recommend it, but with the caveat, if you know a lot of this, don't be expected to be blown away by new stuff. Anyway, hopefully that's my sitting on the fence review done for you. So until the next video, happy gaming.